It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially to follow Suhani. She gave me way too much credit. This is her and her collaborators undertaking. All I really did was look at it and say, wow, that's a great idea, go ahead. So my talk's actually going to be somewhat related to what Suhani was just talking about, as you'll see. Very different setting, very different context, different type of empirical research, but overlapping messages. And so let me start from the big picture that you already know, but I want to just put things in context. The pandemic triggered a shift to more remote work around the world, okay? And that's really happened everywhere, and the extent to which it happened differs a lot across countries depending on the occupational mix of jobs, the educational mix of the workforce, cultural factors, the exact characteristics of their pandemic. But we've seen this shift, across countries around the world. When you look within countries, there's a very pronounced relationship between educational attainment and how much work from home rates have risen since the pandemic struck. And the basic story is more highly educated people have made the bigger shifts into remote work. Now we're going to study how this shift played out in one country, Turkey, in one large firm, okay, called Tempo. It's a major customer service firm with a broad clientele of businesses and government organizations, and much of its work is call centers, and so we're going to focus on those call centers. We've got really super individual level data on productivity and customer quality that's being provided by these call center agents, and so we're going to draw on that high quality data, and we've got it over time from 2019 to 2023. So think of this as a company, and I'll tell you what happened to this company now. Basically, it went from all of its call center agents were working on site almost all of the time to all of its call center agents were working in a fully remote capacity. So the shift was instigated by the pandemic. It was a response to the lockdown restrictions in Turkey, but then they decided to stick with it afterwards. So really a major change. This company, Tempo, they've got about 3,500 employees. Before the pandemic, they operated at physical locations in 7 provinces in Turkey with headquarters in Istanbul. Afterwards, as I've already told you, they shifted to fully remote work. So this shift happened in the space of 2 weeks in March, so very abrupt shift. The company facilitated the shift by providing its call center workers with computers and internet support equipment that they could take home. Okay, so that's the setting. Now, to understand what that meant for the workers, here's the picture. So in panel A, those are 2 snapshots from offices before the pandemic. And the feature that I want you to take away from those office settings is these are high distraction environments with many people working in close physical proximity. And it's an office and it's a crowded one. It's not, don't think of this as luxurious office quarters versus cramped quarters at home. Then on the right side, panel B, those are just 4 different employees working from home after the pandemic. So you can see there's a pretty stark shift in the working environment. And of course, you don't have to commute and so on. So I just want you to understand the context before I show you the results. So here's the summary of the main findings. Big shifts in the composition of the workforce over time towards more representation of women, both single women and married women, older workers, and people who live outside metropolitan areas. Okay, and in the Turkish context, you can think of those as groups, especially among women outside metropolitan areas who had relatively low labor force participation rates. So productivity actually rose as measured by number of customers served per hour by these agents. There was no loss of service quality. In fact, the evidence is suggestive of some slight improvements in service quality, but those effects are small and sometimes not statistically significant, so I won't really emphasize them in my remarks today. The productivity effects were quite similar for men and women. Okay, so here's perhaps the biggest headline result in the paper. And I'll show you a bunch of pictures like this that have two vertical red lines. The leftmost vertical red line, that's when the lockdown restrictions were imposed in Turkey. That's March 11, 2020. And they were lifted late in 2021 in Turkey, and that's kind of a pretty hard shift in Turkey. So we'll think of this intermediate period as being the lockdown period, then there's the before pandemic period, and there's the post-lockdown period. You'll see that over and over again in these pictures. So before the pandemic struck, Tempo's customer service workforce was about 50% women. By the end of this sample period in early 2023, so this is after the lockdown has ended, it's more like 75%. So huge shift towards women, okay? So that's result number one. Now, if you break things down a little bit more finely, and I'll show you a bit of that, you can see that there was also a shift towards more married agents, so people who've got kids to manage and so on, but that was entirely accounted for by a shift to married women. There was no increase in the employment rate at this company of married men. There was also quite a sharp move away from populous provinces, metropolitan areas in Turkey. So this is a group where people might have good skills but found it hard to find a job in close proximity, and this gave them the opportunity to work from home. And then here's the basic story at the whole workforce level. Okay, so here I'm not trying to control for, actually this does have controls for individual fixed effects. We can measure the kinds of calls that these agents are servicing, so there's controls for the mix of calls over time. And this is just showing you what's happened to our basic productivity measure, customer calls serviced per hour. These are all incoming calls, typically responding to some issue or complaint or change in service by the customer. And you can see there's a pretty big increase that happens not immediately, so when they shift to remote work, but within a few weeks. There's an increase in productivity that then persists even after the lockdown restrictions are removed. Now, if you break that down, we can break this down in various ways. It's mainly coming because each agent is spending less time talking to each customer, and they're putting them on hold less often as well, okay? That's the leftmost chart and the top chart. You might worry that, well, they're working from home, maybe they're actually working harder or longer. In fact, they're getting more break time, okay? That's the other panel there. So these agents are increasing their productivity. They are taking less time per customer, a little bit less. Service quality doesn't fall. Break time rises. We think what's happening is basically you're taking these people out of these high distraction, congested environments, putting them in their own home. It's less distracting. It's more comfortable for them. They're able to get more done on their job. Now, there's another aspect that's a little more subtle that's happening. We actually find that the people who start working remotely have a steeper learning curve initially or early on. That's kind of contrary to what you might think, than those who were working at this company before the pandemic. But that kind of, but the on-site workers kind of catch up over a while. And eventually I kind of chop this curve off because there's a high attrition rate here. Eventually you see some considerable drop off in the productivity measure for the remote workers. And that may be some kind of boredom effect or so on that kicks in, but that comes later. I said the productivity patterns are quite similar for men and women. Here they are. There is kind of one, it's not a big difference, but it's one material difference between men and women that I thought you might appreciate seeing, which is men take longer breaks on average. And it's not a huge effect. It amounts to about 10 more minutes of break time per day. And that is offset by the fact that men are slightly less chatty on the phone with the customers. And so these two effects kind of even out in terms of the overall productivity measure. Now, I've painted a pretty positive picture here, okay? You know, we've got these more representation of employment from these groups that typically had more challenges in obtaining employment in the Turkish context. There's not only no productivity loss, there's significant productivity gains, there's no drop-off in customer service quality, and there's actually an increase in break time. So that's all great. It just sounds wonderful. There is one challenge that I haven't emphasized. It's discussed in the paper, and I just want to tee it up here because it is an issue. This is a company that faces high attrition rates. And you can imagine if you're on the phone 8 hours a day talking to people, solving their problems over and over again. So this company typically has attrition rates somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% a year. And that's costly for the company because they've got to train these new employees so that they can service their customers appropriately. The people who work remotely have even higher attrition rates than the company was experiencing before the pandemic. So the company really wants to figure out how can we stay in this remote work mode but reduce the attrition rates. And we are currently fielding an experiment with the cooperation of the company to address that issue. By the way, one of my co-authors on this project is quietly sitting over there, Nick Bloom, both the paper I just talked about and the field experiment. And what we're doing in the field experiment, and I'll end here, is let's bring employees, a randomly selected set of employees, or teams of employees, into the office 1 day a month. Let's have them work, half day or 3/4 of the day, but let's go heavy on the socializing activities, the mentoring activities, getting to know your boss. And what we want to see is, will that establish a closer connection between the employees and the company so that attrition rates go down over time while the company continues to get the benefits of this shift to remote work? Thanks very much.